Okay, we left off. We're in the generations between Adam and Noah. We got through to Lemach, and not to Lemach, to Chanoch, and we ended our discussion a couple weeks ago. Last week, 2 weeks ago, last week with our discussion with Chanoch, who was righteous, but he was taken early. Now we are getting to those final generations prior to Noah, and the individuals, the direct ancestors to Noah, were righteous people, clearly not righteous enough to affect the generation at large, because the generations are just going to get worse and worse. And as we've seen, Cain and Hevel failed when it came to murder. The door of Enosh had failed when it came to Avodah Zarah, and now the adultery and theft is going to plague the world scene, and it's going to get to the point where Hashem says we need a reset, essentially. So the verse describes how Metushelach gave birth to Lemach, and Lemach gives birth to Noach. Now, when Lemach gives birth to Noach, Noach is named prophetically that this is the one who's going to bring rest from our work and from the toil of our hand, from the ground which Hashem had cursed. In fact, the rabbis say that Noach actually invented or modified, perfected many farming tools, and actually made the working of the ground better. And in that sense, he made life somewhat easier for the people. What should have happened, again, would have been the people would have seen the bounty and the releasing of God's curse. They would have seen with it's an interesting thing, if you follow the years, Noach is the first person in the Torah named who was born after Adam dies. You just do the math. Adam lived 930 years. So each one gave birth at so-and-so age. So Noach becomes like the first one born after Adam. So, after Adam was already dead. So the idea was that this was going to be the new beginning. Noach certainly had it conceptually within him to be the one to replace Adam. Noach is going to fail in that role, but he will succeed in keeping the world alive and not suffering the fate of total destruction, which, I suppose it's very good for us, because I don't know what would be with us if the world got destroyed. Who knows if we would have come from the next Buddha. But in any case, Noach is charted. He's got that potential. The problem is that the world is just getting worse. So before, we know the end of the story. It's going to end up needing a reset, and Noach is going to try to jumpstart the world after the reset. But ideally, Noach would have jump-started the world even before the reset and would have made the reset unnecessary. But what's going on concurrently with Noach being born and Noach growing in his righteousness is what is described in the 6th chapter of Bereshis, and that is the incredible descent of man. And essentially, God gave man a unique opportunity with having very long life, which was necessary in order to develop and build things. One of the things that stop progression is if someone comes up with an idea and then before it can spread, that person dies. So with this is an obvious thing. It's a snowball effect. What has led to the incredibly speedy industrial and technological revolution is the ability to communicate ideas across the world, so that you can have an idea here and someone can have an idea across the world, and what would have 20 years ago taken X day, it would have taken 40 years, now it could be done in and go back in time. It already happened. It's so fast. So it builds on each other. So in the early parts of man's existence, before all of that, so there was a different way to solve the problem. Also, you just had less manpower. There were just less people. So the simple solution would be to have people live longer. Well, that would then offset the fact that people would live long enough to communicate because they would have time on their side. All these things were made so that man could succeed more. But like everything else, they have a flip side, which is if you are bad, that means you have bad leadership for a long time. I mean, you can imagine in a democracy, if the guy you don't want wins, okay, 4 years. 4 years, not that it's a long time, but it's only 4 years. In a dictatorship, it's until he'll die. Now, I would imagine if you were growing up in some dictatorship and you really hoped for a change in rulership. So you hope the guy was middle-aged or elderly to start. A young guy probably but when everything was said and done, 60 years, 70 years, if you got a guy living 700 years, it's a big problem. Nothing's changing anytime soon. So the opportunity was presented for mankind to fix itself. Mankind's limitation in its new and not largeness population-wise was offset by the ability to live long. There is indication that at least some people were much larger than people are now. Your giants, who we'll discuss, are the descendants. They stem from these people. There was great longevity in life, and there was physical strength, physical grandeur that didn't necessarily exist beyond the flood era. And it was all for the purpose of giving man a chance to, in its compromised state, with its natural limitations, to give it its chance to succeed. Unfortunately, like everything else, they did not use it to succeed, but on the contrary, they took all the bounty and all the blessing that was given to them and the longevity and the strength, and they channeled it for wickedness. And that's what the verses describe, and we just read them. They're pretty self-explanatory. In chapter 6, man begins to increase upon the face of the earth. Man is populating, and they are living. They're not dying anytime. They're not dying quickly. So man is increasing, and daughters were born to them. Okay, and now comes the next shortcoming in mankind. Okay, again, all your worst vices. We've had avodah zarah, we've had murder, and now we get the third of the big three. The sons of the rulers, whoever took control, however they seized control. And again, there were no democracies. It was might makes right. These were big, strong people, and they didn't die tomorrow. They were there for the long haul, and they felt they were invincible, and they did what they wanted. And they saw the daughter of men were good, and they took them for themselves from whoever they would choose. They would just take married women, unmarried women. It was a free-for-all, and it was a total corruption and breakdown of society, because there was the upper mighty class, and they simply took advantage and manipulated everyone below them. And it manifests itself, as the Torah describes, first and foremost, in a breakdown of morality. God says, my spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man, because he is just flesh. His days will be 120 years. The sages give two different understandings to what this means. And like most times, both are correct. There are some times where we have to do a little bit of gymnastics to make both opinions of the sages correct, like when one says yes and the other says no. It's more complicated. But here it's actually quite simple. There are two different meanings. When Hashem says, I'm not going to deal with man except for 120 years. One explanation is this verse was said 120 years before the flood. And God said, look, man has degenerated. Man has taken all that I have given him in order to come close to me, and he has used it to become distant from me. Instead of building a bond between me and him and recognizing the similarity to God being a giver and not a taker, Man has begun to take whatever he wants. There is no limits. Man has begun to follow the lusts of his body and has not let his soul dominate. And therefore, all of creation is going in the wrong direction, because this is not why God created the world. God created the world so that man would choose to emulate God, and then they can form a union that man earned, and it was going the wrong direction. So God says 120 years, that's it. If it does not correct itself, and I will give mankind an opportunity, I'm going to send them a Noah, I'm going to send them a person who is righteous. He's going to build an ark. It's going to take him 120 years to build this ark. Everyone's going to know that there's an impending doom, and we're going to see if people correct themselves. And if not, that's it. I'm just going to start over. And the notion is, and again, hindsight is so great in this case, but one would have thought, and we're going to show that according to the sages, Noah also fell short in this regard, that, come on, God's not really going to destroy the world, right? I mean, this is all a threat, right? But the truth is that you can't have free will mean something if you can't fail. You know, if everyone gets to be a winner and no one gets to lose, then winning doesn't mean anything anymore. So if there is no ability to fail, success is meaningless. When God said that the world will be created on the condition that mankind follows the law, and if not, the world will be destroyed, it has to be real. The threat has to have teeth behind it. And there was a sense that, come on, there's no way God's really going to destroy the world. So they had 120 years to contemplate that, but there is a repercussion. There is a downside, because again, there has to be, because if there wasn't, then success would mean nothing, if there couldn't be failure. Man continues. Now, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Nephilim is an interesting description. It literally means those who fall, from the word nafal. So the simple explanation, although it's not so simple, would be the people who stumbled and failed were abundant in that world. It's the whole generation. Yeah.
Wait, you never gave what the second.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you. The second explanation of 120 years is the one we're more familiar with, which is man is not cut out for this long life thing. That provides a test, an opportunity, but a test that man cannot seem to overcome. The notion that a person is not dying anytime soon has a tremendous upside. You can do tremendous amounts of good and grow incredibly close to God. However, what practically happened was, more times than not, man took the attitude of, I'll be bad today. I'll satisfy my physical today. I'll take care of it in 200 years from now. Okay. And that just didn't work, because when you got bad for 200 years, you didn't then wake up one day and say, 200 years are up. It's time to be good. You've already rooted yourself in evil. God said, by the time everything sets itself, when the world is, when the Jewish people exists, when that unit of people who will actually replace Adam and will actually get the ball rolling in the right direction, by that time 120 will be the limit, because then everyone will know that they're not on this earth for that long. They don't have time to mess around. They got to get down to business right away. And when they see that nobody lives beyond 120, no one is going to get visions of, this is going on for 500-600 years. And especially since people will already begin to wane and weaken as they get to 60, 70, 80, then there isn't that much time, although youth seems to tend to believe that they still suffer from that we'll live forever, we'll never grow up. But whatever it is with a 120 limit, it would have been much, much worse with a 500-year limit. And in fact, from Moshe Rabbeinu, who lives 120, right, which matches this number, there are very, very, very few people who live beyond 120. The Tanakh has recorded a handful of them. I believe in the history books or the Guinness books, you can find a handful that surpass 120 if the birth date is actually accurate or not. That is up to debate and interpretation. It would not be a contradiction to the verse if you did find someone live 122, 123. It's a generality. Even within the Tanakh itself, we know of people who lived beyond 120. It's not like it's impossible, but it means in general, people will not live beyond 120. I actually just, I just saw in the news that the oldest person in America died recently. Might have been in the last 36 hours because it was just in the news. She was 115. So I think in Japan, they have someone who might be 120, 121. What? 127. Again, you have to know if they have the birthday accurate. But okay, yes, no. But the rule still stands. It's exceedingly uncommon for someone to live beyond 120. That seems to be the max of human longevity. Okay, thank you. Now to the Nephilim. So simply speaking, they are the people who failed, who fell. Nephilim is Nafal is an interesting word because we'll get to the Tower of Babel. Everything really rooted itself in Hebrew. So fall is actually a word that I don't know where it is between the English and the Hebrew, but the Hebrew word nafal is clearly the same word as fall, right? F-A-L-L. I mean, that's clearly the same word. So I'm sure that that you have to trace it back, through the German, the Latin, the this and the that, but it originates in Hebrew, as do many English words. The sages teach us something which is very difficult to understand. So difficult to understand that I'm not going to attempt to explain it. I'll just say it. The question becomes exactly what is being meant. But the upshot is that the Nephilim, they fell, refers to angelic creatures who came down to earth in human form, and they were able to create these super large, super powerful beings. Almost sounds like a foreign type of mythology, type of idea. The most likely, the sages are trying to demonstrate the concept in their terminology, which would be God was showering down upon man a greater sense of physical greatness, and it's being described in the terms of the angels coming down. That would probably be the simplest way to understand a difficult concept. But this long and short of it, or the practical difference is, there were gigantic human beings. The most famous of them, which was Og, king of the Bashan, who Moshe ends up killing many years later. According to the rabbis, he lived through the flood. He was one of these people, and the giants who lived subsequent to that, and we have giants recorded living in Hebron in the times of Avram. Goliath, who was a giant in the times of David, was way smaller than these giants. He was like a midget giant. Goliath is described as something 8 to 10 feet tall, which is.
I don't say, what was the point of having these giants?
Oh, no, so this is part of an expression of the power and might that God had showered upon the early man to allow them to offset the deficiencies that they had by
build.
Right. But they, of course, the giants did not. They all were bad. Right? They used their power negatively. And
so they were the first giants, or was Adam a giant too? Or?
Okay, so the rabbis describe Adam in absolutely humongous terms, but most will understand that means in his ability or his soul, his essence was larger than life for us. But these clearly were physically large people. Og is described as being very big. There definitely were remnants subsequent to the flood. The Sichon, Og, there were giants. They were very large. Again, Goliath, who comes much later, is much smaller than these giants. These were like the real deal giants.
They lived through the flood?
So Og survives the flood.
Oh, I thought that everything was destroyed.
No, us. Yeah, so Og is, because otherwise you're not going to have giants beyond the flood, but we do. So the rabbis say, when we get there, we'll see where the allusions are. But Og hangs on to the boat and he survives. And he then is able to keep the giant race around subsequent to that. Most of the giants seem to be dead by the time the Jews conquer Eretz Yisrael. That's because Og and Sichon they're not like a lot of giants.
And they lived very long.
Yeah, they all had this longevity to them. But Moshe takes care of Og and Sichon. Those are the two biggest giants remaining. And again, the giants of later generations are very big people, but they're just slightly bigger than the biggest people that we have in our natural world. And again, Goliath was an 8 to 9 foot giant, which is gigantic, but we have 7, 8 people. It's just a little.
But on Africa, they have those tribes that
They push 8 feet. You think more than 8 feet?
I don't know.
They'd all be in the NBA. They're
What happened to the giants have giant wives too?
only Og survived.
Yeah, but how did he?
So he was with a regular person. So there was something. Some say Sichon also was a brother. Okay, but yes, they could not easily reproduce, and certainly not in the same way. They were limited, and eventually they lived. Moshe ends up knocking out the rest of the big giants. But the point is there's the idea and also, so again, the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of rulers would consort with the daughters of men who would bear to them, they were mighty who from old were men of devastation, meaning you had this class of powerful people who were meant to improve and build the world, and they took their power and manipulated others and ruled over others and brought the world down with them, and therefore they all ended up dying in the flood, except for Og. He survives, and there's a handful of the remnant of the giants. But as we get to the flood, many commentators explain the need for the flood to be so all-encompassing was specifically to get the giants, because they could climb mountains relatively quickly. So the water needed to go over the height, because the giants it's like the main person that the flood was out to knock out were these gigantic people, and they're the ones who could most easily escape the water until it got so high that even the highest mountains that they can climb onto, it submerged them. And that's one of the understandings of why the world had to be submerged in such a depth of water, was in order to get rid of the giants. Of course, God could just zap the giants. Okay, so that we'll discuss. That's a basic question in the whole flood, story. That we'll get to either the end of today or next time. But yes, once we get past that, which we will address, a lot of the need for the water to be 15 cubits higher than the highest of the mountains was to stop the giants. They had nowhere else to run. Right? There are those who suggest that in so much as man had its fair share of gigantic humans, although not all of them were like that would have then been throughout the animal kingdom, and you would have had gigantic varieties of many different animals, which would of course account for the findings of the bones of gigantic creatures, because there was a class of gigantic beings. So in so much as that there were gigantic humans, there were also gigantic reptiles and gigantic cow creatures, and not all of them, but in whatever blessing that came down to the world that manifests itself in a certain class of man being ginormous. So a similar class of animal would also have been ginormous. And those animals also needed to be gotten rid of, as we will see in the flood, in the ark description. Only some animals are allowed onto the ark. The bad animals, so to speak, are not that animals choose to be bad or not. The animals are not choice creatures, but those animals who, we'll describe it, but who were affected by the way man acted, or whose nature was not consistent with the way the world needed to go on, they also needed to be wiped out. And again, that would contribute to the need for this incredible amount of water in all places. And without getting into the dating of it, because it's a totally different story, it does certainly leave room for the existence of gigantic creatures, because in so much as that there were gigantic people, there also were gigantic animals as well. Okay, so now we're going to ask a question.
Yeah, what about the giants who lived in Eretz Yisrael in the time of the Miragla?
So these were all, again, there were giants who lived in Hebron. There were gigantic people in Israel as well. They would have all have been from Og and his company, and they would have been wiped out by Moshe and subsequently Yoshua. There is descriptions in Devarim also that Ammon and Moab, when they conquered their portion, they also were able to have success against some of the remnant giants who lived. Apparently being a giant was advantageous, but it certainly was not automatic. I mean, it came with its limitations too, like everything else. And yeah, and ultimately God wanted the giants to go, so they eventually went when it was time. All right, so in Pasuk Hey, God sees that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and it was just getting worse. Every product of the thoughts of his heart was but evil always. There was no hope of things reversing themselves, because they were so bad and they were ingrained bad. And again, the leaders weren't dying. They were just living and living. It just was getting worse. And Noah was unable to make any headway in the generation. Okay. And Hashem reconsidered having made man on earth, and he had a heartful sadness. And God says, it's done. We're starting again. I'm going to blot out man who I created from the face of the earth. And with man being gone, there's no need for anything else. I'm going to wipe everything out. And then Noah finds grace in the eyes of Hashem. So essentially what happens is God does a judgment, and he says, the Torah is going back and forth chronologically, because Noah will start building the boat, which already was at the 120 years that it would be like a movie where two things are going concurrently. You're just watching two scenes back, and you're going back and forth. So you're going back in time, front in time. But the idea would be is that God judged, and it's done. We have to start again. And starting again means blotting out man. Now, there are commentators who say that the answer to one of the great puzzles of the Torah, and again, we started out by not dwelling on the 7 days of creation because they are not meant to be understood at a simple level. But one of the commentators, a thought amongst the commentators is that the Torah starts out with a very puzzling beginning, because the Torah starts out in the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth. When the earth was empty, darkness on the deep, the divine presence hovered upon the surface of the waters. So many ask, I don't get it. Where was the water? Where was the darkness? So if you're teaching it simply, it means that there was nothingness, and then God created somethingness. And the Torah starts out by saying God created the world, and then starts backing up by saying, and there was nothing, and God made light. But there are commentators who understand that the world had just experienced a mabul. The previous generation, the previous world failed and did not have a Noah. and it was wiped out. What would the world look like after it was wiped out? It would be void with water. And then God was waiting and started all over again. The idea being that this is not an empty threat. There has to be a consequence. So there are commentators who understand the water that God is hovering over at the beginning of the Torah is the result of the previous Mabul that had wiped out the previous creation, which incidentally takes everything that we find in the ground or whatever to a whole new level of lack of clarity, because they don't know if it's even part of our cycle or not, or how, like, what is it, like, how much was recreated in that, because we never lived through a recreation. We lived through a partial destruction, the Mabul, which was devastating, but the world continued. It could be that the world really started after a previous Mabul. Like, we're not the first.
And that's where they come up with the 7 worlds.
That would be part of that school of thought as well. But it starts with the idea that the Torah begins over water, and God's threat is to bring water. And that's really what God does. He turns the world into water again. The only difference is there was a Noah, and Noah was able to keep the world going. Now, Noah, the idea was that he was supposed to fix the world while he was alive, before the Mabul. That did not work.
Actually do that.
Okay, so
Think about it.
okay, so the problem is like this. The answer to the question is, and how could Avram have done it also? So,
Well, only a couple people have done it.
well, it's going to be the whole world. It's going to be the whole world again also. But what we are going to do between Noah and Avram, because the rabbis do it, there is tremendous parallelism between Noah and Avram. The sages are really interested in figuring out where Avram succeeded, where Noah failed, because Noah was good enough to keep the world going. The idea would have been that once the world reset, he would have been the Adam, right? But he fails especially when he comes off the boat. He does fail in a more concrete way, but most likely we'll understand that that's really the expression of the failure that had already existed. Not to the point where Noah wasn't great enough to keep the world going, but he's not going to be the one. He's going to reset for mankind, but not for the Jewish people, as we will see. But suffice to say, his main objective would have been to reform the world before it got to this point, and he didn't. Now, what could he have done? So the way the sages describe it is that Noah could have done 2 things which he didn't. Noah could have been more proactive in outreach as opposed to waiting for people to come to him. It seems to be that with the construction of the ark, the description is that Noah would be busy building the ark, and people who came and saw the ark would say, "What are you doing?" But it wasn't Noah going out to people. Avram searched people, and he went out. He brought people into his house. He went out and yanked people in. That would be the one thing. And the other thing we're going to see is that Avram is going to pray on behalf of the wicked in the case of Sodom. We never find Noah praying on behalf of his comrades. So there seemed to be some, again, it's a comparison because you're comparing to Avram. So we'll get in the first verse of Noah that he was great in his generation. That's the whole discussion starts out with in his generation, but not in Avram's generation. It's always going to be about Avram. And we'll see in a minute. But he didn't seem to demonstrate the chesed that Avram had, the care for others. He was great, but he was too great for himself and not for others. And to build the world to be the emulation of Hashem, you've got to be a giver and a creator. That's where Noah seemed to have failed and Avram succeeded. But Noah does succeed in keeping the world going, which is again, for our sake, is a very important thing. And Noach survives. The world is going to be reset. That ends Parshas Bereshis. Now, Parshas Noach begins. We have to rewind because the people have already failed, and God came to the point where he was going to destroy the world, but Noach survived. So we've chronologically already gotten to like that first raindrop. But now we're going back to describe what Noach did from the time he was told that he needed to build an ark, which was those 120 years that we had mentioned in the beginning of those section of Psukim. Okay. I'm going to shut down and go back on. So if you are wanting to rejoin us, so do that in a minute, and then you'll get the last 5 or some minutes recorded. All right, so then we get to the beginning of our second parsha. Elie told us Noah. Okay, so now these are the generations of Noah. This is going to be essentially the world as we know it. Noach's going to restart everything. You have Noach, who's an ish tzaddik tamim hayu b'dorosav, as Elokim hisalech Noach. So Noach is described as a righteous man, a wholesome, pure man in his generation, and with God Noach walked. So the rabbis point out, first of all, that word in his generation is either to say the praise of Noah, even in a lousy generation like this, he still remained steadfast, but it's also in the negative. Had he been in Avram's generation, he would have been a nobody compared to Avram. And that really is where Noah fits in. Noah was great. He kept the world going, but he failed in starting the Jewish people. But he kept the world going so that an Avram could eventually descend from him, right? It's not an accident that Avram comes descendant of Noah. Now it's going to be filtered once to Shem as opposed to the other 2 sons, but Noah is the restart. So he is going to be the representation of mankind, and the Jewish people will eventually come out from Noah, although it will be attributed to Abraham, not to Noah, because Noah ultimately was Tamim in his generation. He didn't stand to the level of Abraham. And even in the language with God, Noah walked, gives the implication that Noah went hand in hand with God. But Rashi brings in chapter 17, verse 1, if you want to just quickly flip to that, that is going to be on page 73. When Avram was 99 years old, Hashem appeared to Avram and said to him, I am Kel Shaddai, walk before me and be perfect. And the rabbis note, and they constantly are making the comparison between Noah and Avram because they are very comparable people, because one almost was the reset and one is the reset, yet the one who was the almost did keep the world going. So where's the difference? They're both Tamim, but you have Avram is walking before God. Noach's walking with God. That indication is Avram went to the next level. Avram took it to the next level, and in that, he becomes the forerunner of the Jewish people, and Noach becomes the forerunner of mankind, and ultimately the Jewish people. Now, Noach is going to ultimately fail in his mission. After Noach fails, then he has 3 sons who are going to choose to be the one. So he's going to have 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yafes. One of them is going to be the one, and the other 2 are, well, I think all 3 of them could have all been great, right? They had that opportunity. What's going to happen is one of them is going to surpass the other one, who's going to surpass the other one, and you're going to lock in 3 courses of mankind. The descendants of Shem, the Semites, the descendants of Yafes, and then the descendants of Ham. Each one could have been the one to be the Jewish people. None of them are going to be the one, but Shem is going to be the one who is great enough to keep the momentum going that will eventually produce the Avraham. Okay, so the stage is set. Noach is around. He has his children. The world is totally corrupt before God. It's filled with Hamas, which Chazal understand as theft. And theft, in the Bereshis, we learned it was adultery. But in reality, they are just two expressions of the same thing, which is what's yours is not yours. If I want it, I will take it. And whether it be a wife, whether it be property, that's the same moral failing of not recognition of we are here to give, we are here to provide, we are here to emulate God, we are not here to take and to, say everything is mine and give me, what's yours. We are here also to build loyal relationships, primarily with God, and it manifests, it parallels itself in a husband-wife relationship, that loyal relationship, which is a expression of the connection that man has with God, then man has with man, and then it trickles down to community and so on and so forth. That totally broke down in these days. The mighty people, they seized women, they seized property, they had totally corrupted the world order. So God sees the world, it's corrupt, it's destroyed. Kol basar in Pasuk Yud Beis, all flesh had corrupted its ways on the earth. And some of the commentators explain that literally some of the animals were affected by the environment. They actually followed man. There have actually been studies done, even in the modern era, that sometimes animals will mimic the actions of the people around them. So it seemed to be that the animals themselves became corrupt and dominating and attacking and taking, and even more than their animal nature. And they're going to be punished again, not because they are being punished, because they're not free willers, but they become the extension of man. And just like man needs to be wiped out, the product of man's wickedness, these wicked animals will also need to be wiped out. And that's where we'll leave off at Pasuk Yud Gimel. God is going to tell Noach about the impending doom of man, which we already read about at the end of Bereshis. Now we're going to go back and flesh out that story of the creation of the ark, the discussion of bringing the animals onto the ark, what's going to be with the ark, and then the flood, and so on and so forth. So we will pick that up in Mirz Hashem next time. Okay.
It's getting good.
Yeah.